The birthday cake had 40 candles, not a single one of them was lit. Celeste Kingsley sat perfectly still at the center of a private dining room set for 40 guests, surrounded by white orchids flown in from Hawaii, aged wine that cost more per bottle than most people earned in a week, and a three-tiered cake that no one had come to taste. The chandelier above her cast a warm, golden light across 40 empty chairs, and the silence in that room was not the peaceful kind. It was the kind that arrives after something has been decided without you. She had checked her phone 11 times in the past hour. Not one message. Not one explanation. Not one apology. The restaurant manager was moving toward her table, his expression carrying that particular combination of sympathy and discomfort that Celeste had learned to recognize over the past 18 months, the look people gave a woman in a wheelchair when they didn't know whether to speak or simply clear the table around her. And that was the moment a stranger stepped through the door. Not a guest. Not a board member. Not family. Just a man with sawdust on his jacket, a daughter at his side, and 2 chairs he was about to pull from the nearest table. Stay until the end. Because what those 2 chairs set in motion, shook an entire empire down to its foundation. The Holston Grand occupied 37 floors above the city's financial district, and its rooftop restaurant was the kind of place where reservations required a name that meant something in the right circles. Celeste Kingsley's name had meant something in those circles for 27 years. She had not reserved a table for the evening. She had rented the entire private dining room, a sweep of floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking a glittering skyline, draped in white linen and set with place settings that gleamed under warm chandelier light. The flowers were fresh white orchids. The wine had come from a small Napa vineyard that produced fewer than 2,000 bottles a year. Every detail was exact. Every detail was perfect. And not one person had come to share any of it. Celeste was 38 years old. 18 months ago, she had been the kind of woman that financial journalists called visionary, the founder and CEO of Kingsley Mobility Group, a company that designed and manufactured assistive technology for people with physical disabilities. She had built it from a single patent into a billion-dollar enterprise with 300 employees and a research pipeline that was considered one of the most ambitious in the industry. Then her car had left a wet expressway at 60 miles an hour, and the woman who had never once asked anyone to slow down for her had spent 6 months learning how to move through a world that suddenly looked entirely different from a wheelchair. She had come back. That was not in question. She had returned to the boardroom with the same precision she had applied to every other problem in her life, studying, adapting, refusing to allow anyone to treat the chair as a diminishment of what she was. But the people who had once feared her had spent 18 months learning how to organize their distance. 40 empty chairs on the night of her birthday were not a coincidence. And she knew it. Owen Carver was not supposed to be on that floor at all. He had taken the job, a repair on a warped oak door that led from the main corridor into the private event space, because the Holston Grand was a long-standing client, and because his daughter Avery had agreed to meet him there afterward for dinner, and because the work was simple enough that he could finish it in under an hour and still have time to wash his hands before the food arrived. He was 39 years old, lean in the particular way of men who work with their hands without thinking about it, with dark brown hair that was always slightly overdue for a cut and warm eyes that had seen enough difficult things to have learned patience. He had spent 11 years designing load-bearing systems for a structural engineering firm before his wife died, and his daughter was 12 years old, and the corporate schedule no longer fit the life that actually needed him. He restored furniture now. He was good at it. And on the evening of Celeste Kingsley's 38th birthday, he was kneeling beside a warped oak doorframe with a hand plane and a strip of sandpaper when the sound of glasses being cleared from an untouched table drifted through the gap, and something in it made him stop. The sound was unhurried. Apologetic. The particular rhythm of service staff removing things that had outlasted their purpose. He looked through the narrow opening without intending to. And he saw her. She was positioned at the center of the table the way a person sits when they have decided, consciously or not to move to a corner. Her posture was straight and controlled. Her expression was carefully arranged into something that was working very hard not to be devastation. Owen did not calculate the distance between their worlds. He did not consider what a woman like Celeste Kingsley might think of a man like him walking uninvited into her evening. He stepped through the door, crossed to the nearest table, and pulled out 2 chairs, one for himself, one for Avery, who stood just behind him with her jacket still on and her eyes wide with the quiet understanding that comes from watching a parent follow an instinct too clear to question. He placed the chairs across from Celeste, close enough that she would have to look at him, and said simply, and without apology, "Would you mind if we sat with you?" Celeste studied him the way she studied everything that arrived without warning, with attention and suspicion in equal measure. She told him plainly that she had not asked for company. That she did not need anyone's pity. Owen said he wasn't offering pity. He said his daughter had a weakness for good chocolate ganache and that it would be a shame to let 3 tiers of what appeared to be an excellent cake go to waste on an empty room. Avery, without being asked, sat down, pulled a small plate toward herself, and asked Celeste which flavor the bottom tier was, as though the answer mattered very much. Th question was so ordinary, so entirely unaware of the weight of the evening, that Celeste's composure slipped for just a moment. And then, quietly and unexpectedly, she laughed. Not the polished laugh she used in boardrooms to signal warmth without vulnerability. A real laugh. The laugh of someone who had forgotten what it felt like to be treated like a person at a birthday party rather than a problem to be managed. She told Avery the bottom tier was lemon curd. Owen served 3 slices. The candles were still unlit. And for a few minutes in that empty room, nobody mentioned the 40 chairs. But when Owen stood to go, Celeste's phone lit with a message from an unknown number. She read it twice before she let herself react. The party tonight was just the beginning. Resign before everyone else walks away too. Can you imagine how she felt in that moment? Sitting in a room designed for 40 people who had not come, holding a phone that told her the isolation had been engineered, and across the table, a stranger who didn't know any of it was asking his daughter if she wanted the last bite of her cake. Owen noticed the change in her expression before she had time to arrange it. He didn't ask. He pulled the chairs back to the table he had taken them from, said goodnight, and left. But he crouched beside her wheelchair before he went, without asking permission, and pulled a small multi-tool from his jacket pocket. He examined the locking mechanism on the left rear wheel with the focused attention of a person who has learned to read mechanical problems the way other people read faces. He made 3 small corrections. Tested the mechanism twice. Stood back up. Celeste told him flatly that the chair was a prototype produced by her own company's engineering division, designed by a team with more combined credentials than he was likely to encounter in one room. Owen said he didn't doubt it. And that the team appeared to have placed the locking bracket roughly 2.5 degrees off true north. He left before she could respond. The following morning, Celeste discovered the real reason behind the 40 empty chairs. Every guest on the evening's list had received an email notification informing them the dinner had been cancelled, at her personal request, sent from her assistant's company account at a time when her assistant had been documented across town at a vendor meeting. Someone with access to the company's internal systems had decided that Celeste's birthday would end in isolation. And had made sure of it. She called Owen from her car and offered him a contract to evaluate the mobility prototype. She framed it as a professional engagement with a documented scope and a rate she named directly. He declined. He said he was a craftsman who restored furniture and that the world she moved in was not his. Celeste said that was precisely why she was asking him. That the world she moved in had given her a defective product and 40 empty chairs. And that she wasn't offering charity. She was offering work. The pause on his end of the line lasted long enough that she began to think she had misjudged him. Then he asked what time she needed him at the office. She said 8. The conversation ended. When Owen stepped off the elevator the following morning, Everett Kingsley, Celeste's cousin, and the man who had been managing the company's strategic direction during her recovery, was standing at the far end of the corridor in a well-tailored charcoal suit, watching their approach with the patient expression of a man recalculating odds on something he had previously considered settled. He turned to Veronica Ashford, standing 2 steps behind him, and asked in a voice pitched just low enough for her to hear. Asterisk, how much does that man know? Asterisk. Owen spent the morning in the research laboratory, reviewing design documents Celeste had pulled herself. The engineering team watched him from across the room with the particular expression that specialists reserve for someone who has arrived without a recognizable title. He did not explain himself. He spent 20 minutes observing Celeste navigate the prototype across a range of surfaces, smooth floor, a transition strip, a gentle ramp, then asked to see the original design files. Not the current version. The first. The one that existed before the revision cycle completed 6 weeks prior. When he finished, he listed 3 issues. The wheel lock mounting had been repositioned from the original specification by a margin that shifted lateral force onto the user's arms on uneven terrain. The balance sensors had been recalibrated to prioritize performance in ideal conditions rather than the variable surfaces actual users encountered daily. And the central control logic had been weighted toward impressive demonstration room performance at the expense of reliable daily function. He noted carefully, and without accusation, that these 3 changes had not existed in the original design. That someone had altered the product specifications within a 6-week window. And that the alterations were not the kind of accumulated drift that came from iterative testing, but deliberate choices that moved the product away from user safety. Celeste asked her lead engineer to pull the revision history. The access logs for that period had been deleted. Not archived. Not encrypted. Removed entirely. Everett appeared in the doorway 40 minutes later, carrying coffee and the measured expression of a man who had learned to enter rooms as though he belonged everywhere. He was gracious with Owen and curious about his background, and then, in front of the full engineering team, asked Celeste in a reasonable tone what her process had been for verifying the credentials of an external consultant given access to proprietary technology. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse her of anything specific. But the construction of the question did exactly the work he intended. It framed her decision as impulsive, personal, possibly compromised by a relationship that had begun at a social occasion rather than through the company's procurement channels. Celeste met his gaze without moving. She told him that the external consultant had located a fault in the product that her internal team had not reported. And she would appreciate it if he left the room. After Everett was gone, Owen told her quietly that he hadn't agreed to come in order to be deployed in a family dispute. That his interest was limited to the fact that a flawed product reaching the market would cause physical harm to people who depended on mobility equipment to function safely in their daily lives. Celeste looked at him for a long moment. And then said something she had not admitted to anyone. That after the accident, everyone around her had begun speaking more slowly. Choosing simpler words. Carrying expressions that communicated more sympathy than belief, as though the failure of her spine had somehow transferred to her mind. That she had spent 18 months trying to prove otherwise. And that it was exhausting in a way she had never said aloud. Owen said, asterisk, you don't need to prove you're still a person to anyone in this room. Asterisk. Smething in the distance between them changed after that. Neither of them named it. That night, Owen returned home to find a plain envelope tucked under the windshield wiper of his truck. Inside was a photograph of him and Avery leaving the Holston Grand the previous evening. Below it, a single typed line. Asterisk, stay away from Celeste Kingsley. Or your daughter will pay for your curiosity, asterisk. He did not sleep that night. He did not call Celeste, because telling her would have required admitting that someone inside her world had extended a threat toward his family. And admitting that would give her an opening to do what people with her resources inevitably did. Deploy a solution. Arrange protection. Make Avery part of a problem she didn't know existed. He returned the access card before business hours. Left a brief message with Celeste's assistant saying only that the engagement wasn't a fit. And drove home. He told himself it was clean that it wasn't. Celeste called before he reached the end of the block. She said she knew he was lying. Not because she had information he didn't, but because she had been watching people lie to her face since her wheelchair became the first thing they noticed when she entered a room. And she recognized the particular quality of a lie told by someone trying to protect rather than deceive. Owen said only that he had a daughter to think about. Celeste's response came with a quietness that cost her more than she showed. She told him he sounded like everyone else, willing to be present when things were easy, willing to disappear when they became complicated. That she had hoped he was different. Owen said the difference was that he wasn't leaving because of her wheelchair, her wealth, or her temper. Then he told her about the photograph. The silence that followed was different from any silence he had encountered before. Not the controlled quiet of a composed woman deciding how to respond. The stillness of someone who had received information they had been half expecting, and had not wanted confirmed. Meanwhile, Celeste had already begun pulling security footage from the night of her birthday. She found the gap within 20 minutes. 17 minutes of corrupted footage in the corridor connecting the private dining suite to the administrative wing, beginning at 8:43 in the evening. Long enough for someone who knew the building well to access her assistant's workstation without being recorded. She cross-referenced the maintenance log for the security system. The disruption had been approved through the facility's management portal under an administrative account. The account belonged to Veronica Ashford. Celeste had known Veronica for 19 years. They had sat beside each other in a law school lecture hall on the first day of the semester and had not stopped talking until the professor called order. Veronica had been at the hospital the night of the accident. She had been in Celeste's kitchen the morning she came home from rehabilitation. She called Veronica directly, not through an assistant, not from a company line, and asked simply whether she had authorized the camera disruption. Veronica did not deny it. She said it had been a measure of assessment. That the board had been watching closely since the accident. That Celeste's association with an unvetted outsider was precisely the kind of evidence that would be used against her at the governance review scheduled for the following week. When Celeste asked who had initiated the review, Veronica said the formal request had come from Everett. And that it had already collected enough supporting signatures to proceed regardless of what Celeste could refute in the time remaining. Veronica paused at the office door before she left. Turned back. And said, in the tone of someone delivering a fact rather than a threat. Asterisk, the accident took your legs. This vote will take the rest of your name. Asterisk. Celeste had not allowed herself, in 18 months, to consider the possibility that the accident had been anything other than mechanical failure. The police report was thorough. The insurance investigation had concurred. The sensor defect that caused her car's stability system to fail on the wet expressway had been attributed to a manufacturing variance documented in a limited recall. She had read the report 4 times. She had accepted the conclusion. Because the alternative, that someone close to her had known the risk and done nothing, was a thought she had not been ready to hold. She was ready now. 18 months earlier, in the 2 weeks before the accident, she and Everett had argued sharply over a proposed acquisition. A mid-sized component supplier called Vestrum Dynamics had been brought to the board's attention by Everett, framed as a strategic opportunity to bring key manufacturing in-house. Celeste had reviewed Vestrum's safety compliance record and found 3 unresolved notices from federal regulators, 2 of which related to sensor calibration failures in their output components. She had blocked the acquisition in the preliminary vote. The accident occurred 9 days later. She had not connected these events because grief and recovery do not leave room for pattern recognition. And because the people she had trusted most had been standing in her hospital room telling her how lucky she was to be alive, she drove to Owen's workshop that afternoon without calling ahead. Found him planing the edge of a walnut panel. And told him everything. Owen set down his tools and listened the way he worked, carefully, without rushing toward a conclusion. He said he wasn't able to tell her the coincidence meant what she thought it meant. That she needed something stronger than timeline alignment before she brought it anywhere. Then he agreed to help. Because the alternative was leaving her to carry it alone. And because he had already spent enough nights thinking about that photograph under his windshield wiper to know that distance from this woman's life was not actually available to him anymore. They spent 2 days going through records Celeste had stored on a personal device she had never connected to the company network. Owen brought the same methodical attention he had given the wheelchair prototype, not looking for something dramatic, but for a specific technical signature. A code string embedded in the calibration parameters of the balance sensors. He found it in 3 places. The sensor firmware used in the prototype. The calibration specification in Vestrum Dynamics product catalog. And a procurement memo in which Everett had pressed for expedited approval of the supplier relationship before Celeste's review was complete. The picture was not complete enough to prove that Everett had caused the accident. What it showed was that Everett had received safety compliance documents predating the crash by 6 weeks. Had been informed of the sensor risk. Had continued to advocate for the acquisition. And had said nothing to the woman driving a vehicle that contained a component from a flagged batch. Owen said it plainly. Everett had not pulled a wire, had not cut a cable, had not tampered with a brake line. What he had done was make a calculation about whose life was worth more than his profit margin. And Celeste had been on the wrong side of it. They were sitting in the workshop, Celeste holding a chisel she had picked up without thinking, Owen fitting a replacement tenon into a chair joint, when she said quietly that she had been afraid, for the better part of a year, that no one would ever want her for herself. Not for her name. Not for the company. Not out of obligation or sympathy. Just for her. Owen didn't answer immediately. When he did, he said he had pulled out 2 chairs in an empty restaurant because a woman was sitting alone at her own birthday. And that it had had nothing to do with Kingsley Mobility or anything with a dollar value attached to it. He said he had seen a person who needed company. And he had sat down. Before Celeste could respond, a notification appeared from the board's governance office. The review had been moved to 7 the following morning, 48 hours ahead of schedule. Everett knew she was looking. The boardroom of Kingsley Mobility Group was a room designed to communicate permanence. Dark wood paneling. 12 leather chairs. The family name embossed in glass above the main entrance. By 7:15 in the morning, every seat was filled. Everett's presentation was methodical, 4 lines of evidence, each dressed in the language of governance rather than ambition. The prototype's defects, framed as failure of oversight under Celeste's tenure. The stock chart, angled to suggest diminished investor confidence. The decision to bring Owen into a restricted research environment without formal vetting. And a summary he described as a pattern of emotionally driven decision-making since her return to the office. Veronica distributed folders. Inside, photographs of Celeste and Owen at the Holston Grand, the image cropped to emphasize informality, accompanied by a caption noting that the individual pictured had accessed proprietary technology within 72 hours of their first meeting. The room had the particular quality of a space where a decision has already been made, and the meeting exists only to provide it with documentation. The vote came out 8-8. With Veronica Ashford holding the last ballot. Veronica looked at Celeste across the length of the table, took a breath, and voted to remove her. Celeste Kingsley lost the chairmanship of Kingsley Mobility Group by a single vote cast by the woman who had once been her closest friend. She left through the front entrance. There were journalists on the lower steps, already there, already briefed. Someone had tipped them, because a removal this clean required a narrative already in place. Celeste moved through them without stopping, her chin level, her expression giving them nothing that could be used as a caption about fragility or defeat. She would not take the service entrance. She had built 27 years of her professional life in this building, and she would leave it the way she had entered, through the front door, in full view, with her name still above the entrance even if her signature was no longer on the accounts. But the story wasn't over. It was Owen who found the financial thread 3 days later, tracing the corporate structure of Vestrum Dynamics through public registration documents. The acquisition would route a substantial portion of its transaction value through a holding vehicle registered in Delaware, with a beneficial ownership structure that led through 2 intermediate entities to a family trust that Veronica Ashford had established 4 years prior. Veronica had not cast the deciding vote as a favor to Everett. She had cast it as a financial partner, with a material interest in the acquisition she had never disclosed to the board. That evening, Veronica called Celeste from a number she didn't recognize. And said, "If you want to know what really happened to your car, come alone." Celeste came alone. Or nearly. She had told Owen where she was going, and at what time, and agreed to check in every 30 minutes, because the difference between courage and recklessness was sometimes just a second person who knew your location. The meeting was at the Holston Grand. The same private dining room. The same view. But the 40 empty chairs were gone, and the space had been returned to ordinary use, stripped of everything that had made it a celebration that never happened. Veronica told her the truth in pieces. She had authorized the camera disruption. She had helped Everett build the case against Celeste's judgment. She had been promised a position in the restructured company, and had come to understand, within the past 72 hours, that Everett intended to position her as the sole architect of Celeste's removal and walk away clean. And then she said what actually mattered. 7 days before the accident, Everett had received a safety compliance report from Vestrum Dynamics as part of the acquisition due diligence. The report identified a calibration failure in a sensor component across several production batches, including the batch that had supplied the manufacturer of Celeste's vehicle. The report had been forwarded to Everett directly, with full documentation. He had not transmitted it to any regulatory coordinator. He had not contacted the manufacturer. He had not told Celeste that her car contained a sensor from a flagged batch. He had held the information for 7 days while the acquisition negotiations continued, because the recall would have killed the deal. And the deal was worth a number that, to Everett, apparently outweighed the calculation of what might happen to his cousin on a wet expressway. Veronica had kept the email. The original forwarded compliance report, with Everett's name on the recipient line, and a timestamp that predated the accident by 7 days. She handed it over. They arrived at Everett's acquisition signing 3 days later, Celeste, Owen, Veronica, and 2 independent attorneys carrying copies of the documentation. The room went quiet the way rooms go quiet when the thing everyone has been maneuvering around suddenly sits down at the table without an invitation. Graham Wexler read the email. Reviewed the design modification history. Traced the beneficial ownership chain for Ashford Strategic Holdings. He suspended Everett, cancelled the signing, and called for a full independent investigation before the first hour was out. The board voted to restore Celeste's position before the business day ended. She declined. She returned the following morning with conditions. A standing independent safety oversight committee with authority to halt any product launch until a full user panel review was completed. An advisory group of actual product users, people who relied on Kingsley's devices in their daily lives, embedded in the development process from the earliest design stage. No acquisition to proceed without a transparent third-party safety audit regardless of financial timeline. The board accepted all 3 conditions. Then they asked her to come back as CEO. She said yes. Not because the title mattered the way it once had. Not to restore a name or prove something to the people who had voted to remove her. But because the work itself mattered. And because she was better at it than anyone else in the room. And she had stopped pretending otherwise. Owen accepted the position of Director of User Experience Design, a title Celeste invented specifically to describe a job that did not previously exist at the company, on one condition. That she agreed in advance, and in writing, that he had the right to contradict her in any meeting at any time without it affecting his employment. She signed the clause herself. And initialed it. 1 year after the birthday that no one attended, Celeste turned 39. She did not rent a room for 40. She did not hire a pastry chef. She asked Owen to choose the venue. Her only requirement was that it be small, and real, and free of people who attended things like this in order to be seen attending. He chose the workshop. Not as it had been the first time she walked into it, but as it had become over 12 months. A shared design studio used during the week by engineers and craftspeople working on something that mattered. A small number of people, selected for the quality of their honesty rather than the size of their stake. Avery was there. Several engineers who had been let go under Everett and rehired under Celeste were there. 2 members of the user advisory panel, people who depended on Kingsley products in their daily lives and had spent 8 months telling the company what wasn't working, were there. And at the center of the room, placed on a cleared section of the main workbench, were 2 chairs. The same 2 Owen had pulled from a corner of the Holston Grand's dining room on the night of her 38th birthday, the chairs the restaurant had flagged for disposal because one carried a cracked leg. He had spent 3 weekends restoring them. The cracked leg rebuilt with a mortise and tenon joint cut from matching walnut. The grain refinished until it held weight the way it was always meant to. They did not look repaired. They looked as though they had always been exactly what they were. She arrived early. Found him standing beside them. He pulled one out for her without ceremony, the way he had done it the first time. Not with a bow or a production. Just the simple, unhurried action of a person making room for someone else. She settled into it. He moved toward the other. And she put her hand on the armrest of the chair beside her before he could take it. She told him she had been thinking about that first night. About how he had thought he was pulling out 2 chairs. But what he had actually done was remind her that choosing to stay beside someone, when every easier option was available, could be its own kind of door. Owen looked at her. At the room. At the people gathered in it. At the 2 restored chairs standing where 40 empty ones had once made a statement about a life full of the wrong things. And he asked her quietly, and without drama. Asterisk, can I keep sitting beside you? Asterisk. Celeste looked at the chair he had placed for her. The same chair rebuilt, its cracked leg repaired, its surface refinished until it held weight the way it was always meant to. And said. Asterisk, this seat has always been yours. Asterisk. The room that had once been set for 40 and held no one, now held exactly the people who had chosen to be there. And in the center of it, 2 chairs that had stood empty at a party for 40 were occupied at last. Not by the right names. Not by the right titles. By the right people. And that was more than enough.